In the previous episode of Expressiveness, we talked about articulation. Today we will dive a little bit deeper. And what is that adds depth to our song? It's amplitude, or if we prefer, dynamics. Many musical instruments can play sounds at different volumes, so the same note can be softer or louder. We can call dynamic range the difference between the softest and the loudest sound that an instrument can produce. When playing a melody, we can use dynamics to emphasize certain notes or passages, or to create some more dramatic effects, like notes fading in or out. The main symbols in Western music to mark these things are the dynamic symbols, which are mainly derived from Italian terms. As always, if you are familiar with other musical traditions that have different ways of marking the dynamics of a piece, let us know in the comments. So the two main symbols are piano and forte, which mean respectively quiet and loud. On a side note, the piano is called pianoforte and its ancestor was called fortepiano because both instruments are able to play loud and soft sounds, as opposed to the harpsichord, which had a pretty flat dynamic range. There are many symbols beside those two to mark different dynamic shades, like half loud or very, very, very quiet, but as you can guess, they are far from being absolute references. So in MIDI notation we have, for example, 127 degrees of amplitude that a note can have. And there are many reference charts that are attempting to translate the classical Western notation to absolute MIDI values, like this one. But we make modular synthesizer, and that is what we'll talk about today. So we have this sequence here, we have already played with different gate length, and in modular synthesizers the main tool that we can use to change our dynamics is of course the VCA. For example, we can use a CV to change the amplitude of one specific note, like the CVB channel of our track 1. However, as you can tell, we already patch something to our VCA input, which is the envelope that is controlling the individual notes. Normally we would use the 333 to mix two different voltages to control the same destination, but this time is different because we don't need to sum the two signals, because we need a CV that controls the depth of our envelope. We need to multiply them, so we will use, as the name suggests, the 4-quadrant multiplier. So I'm going to patch my unipolar output. Well, I don't need to patch anything actually, because this is already semi-normal to the first input of this 4-quadrant multiplier, and instead I'm gonna patch my CVB to the second input and then patch the 4-quadrant multiplier output to the VCA. You will hear nothing at the moment, but as soon as I add my CVB values, will hear that the envelope is coming back again, and now I can make some envelopes louder than some others, and perhaps let me see, I can set them quieter like this, make this. Perhaps there. I can crank it up a little bit more, and you can clearly hear and see the difference in amplitude between these two voltages. Now we can say that we came up with a melody with just a few notes that stand out more than the others. In this case we can talk about accents, and we have a symbol for them, which looks like this. It is easier to read as opposed to dynamics marks all over the place. So another way of creating accent is by combining two different envelopes through FALISTRI's max output. And here's how we're gonna do that. So we're gonna go back to our first configuration with our unipolar output controlling this. No, but instead we're gonna use this output here. You can hear that if I push this button here and activate the second envelope, I cause an increase in amplitude. And for this reason, I can select a parallel stream of gates, which can be our CVB, and use it to control some envelopes. And this is not even a sum, because this is outputting the highest voltage between those two. So whenever this one is higher than this, it will take control of the envelope. So by setting this envelope with by setting these envelopes at an inverter to a higher magnitude, we make this more predominant whenever it strikes. It goes without saying that we need to strike this envelope less time than this one, otherwise it would be just all over the place. So far we've been focusing only on the individual notes, but we may also want more gradual changes that affect the melody as a whole. For example, we may want a melody that starts quiet and finishes loud, or vice versa. The Western symbols for this technique are crescendo and diminuendo, which we may translate as increasing and decreasing. Now we are back to the 4-quadrant multiplier technique, and if we want to create a crescendo or a diminuendo over our melody, we can take advantage of the set all button for CVB. So we can gradually we can mix it with the coarse button to apply the same coarse setting to all the following stages. So we can start with a fairly low voltage, and we will see that all the following stages are set to the same value. So if we move on to the second one, this and the following one will increase, and we can just gently rotate by one turn all these encoders to create a steady crescendo. And for the diminuendo is the same, so we can set this one to a high value and then reduce this other one. So we have a melody that starts loud and gradually decreases. In many instruments, like for example the piano, we cannot control the amplitude of a note once we have struck it. So, for example, to perform a crescendo, we need to play one note louder than the previous one, and we appreciate the increase in dynamics only through the whole melody. However, on some instruments like woodwinds or bowed strings, we are able to control the amplitude of our sound after the attack. So we can perform crescendos and diminuendos on a single note basis. It is thus possible to make individual notes fade in and fade out. If we want to achieve a similar effect on our modular synthesizer, we can no longer use the CVB as we did before, because it sets a value at the beginning of a stage and it holds it until the next one. So with CVB, we're basically stuck with the same dynamics throughout the stage, like for example on a piano or on a guitar. However, I could think of a couple of ways of doing this kind of things with this modular system. So to better appreciate a note fading in or fading out, we need a slow melody so that we have enough time to understand what's going on. So I slowed down this sequence, the previous pattern, and the first idea that came to my mind is requires cloning track 1. So we're gonna clone track 1 over track 2. Now we have the same CVB pattern on both tracks. And basically what I just want to do is to patch my CVB of track 2, which mirrors CVB of track 1, to the CV input of my envelope. Now you already can hear that sometimes the envelope kind of fades in, and of course I could have simply multiplied it with the 333, but I think it's worth using another track because it allows us more freedom. So for example, we can make sure to match the note with longer gates, for example this one, and assign to this stage a higher CV. Now in this patch here, it is fundamental, the articulation that we discussed in the previous video, because the only way to appreciate note fading in, a sort of crescendo on the single note, is through a longer gate. And this one also has a pretty long gate, so we can go to our CVB and give it just a little bit of fading in, like this. And perhaps we can add some reverb. Now the second idea is a little bit more rudimentary, but it works when you have only one track, or when you want to use only one track. And basically we don't use any other CV, we are just it is the same 4-quadrant multiplier track, so we're using a CVB of track 1 to control the amplitude of this envelope here, the magnitude of this envelope here. But what I did is that I used the green color to slide, to integrate from this low voltage to this high one, thus making this envelope fade in. And of course, to appreciate it, I need a longer gate, so I always must keep track of my articulation, as we discussed in the previous video. But for example, I can do the same also here. We've come pretty far with dynamics, but there is one last thing that we need to consider. On most musical instruments, a change in dynamics also corresponds to a change in timbre. You can really think about a lot of instruments that, when played softly, they provide a quieter tone, but also a mellower timbre, and vice versa. So with louder sounds, we have brighter timbre and more overtones. Let us then transpose this concept to the modular synthesizer. And since we're talking about timbre, we have BRENSO's timbre section that fits this purpose perfectly. And this is why I've been using the final output this whole time. So instead of using my 4-quadrant multiplier patch to control the VCA, I'm gonna patch it to the wave folder and adjust the modulation amount. And you can hear now that with an increment in amplitude that corresponds to an increment in timbre. And while we are here, if you remember the accents that we've been talking about at the beginning of this video, we can use the gate B of our track to add some accents through BRENSO. For example, through the wave folder input. If we don't have the BRENSO, or if we have a simple sine wave oscillator or a triangle oscillator, we can use the saturation to change the timbre. And of course, this is really mild. For example, I can transpose the patch up by 1 octave. You can hear that it adds more color. Since we are talking about dynamics, I think that the last technique for today could be the tremolo, which is a constant amplitude modulation, a repetitive amplitude modulation, like we could have by patching a LFO to our channel, which makes our note repetitively fade in and out. Now, if we want to achieve this kind of modulation, there are many ways, but if we want to keep our track consistent, we may need quite some CV, but I think that this is definitely possible. So let's go back to our 4-quadrant multiplier patch. I need to set this back to so let's say that I want to play a tremolo over this note here. My idea is to use a gate, for example, gate B, and use it to force this to the loop stage, which is something like this. Now, I must make sure that this doesn't have a long gate, otherwise it will override the signal, so I can give it just a very fast note. And I need to blend it with a fairly low voltage. But you can hear that this is very sharp because I need to modulate the attack. So I can go to my second track, which is still a copy of my track 1, and use this CVB here to modulate the attack and make it as close as possible to the decay. Let's see. This is too slow. This is too fast. And I can play with other CVs to make it faster or slower. To wrap everything up, today we saw how to use dynamics to add expressiveness to our patch. In the previous episode we saw how to use articulation, and we can combine these things together. There is still much to uncover about expressiveness, for example agogic and ornaments, so stay in touch for the future videos. I hope you found this one useful, and I will see you next time.